All the same?
Subtly different.
Well, I'm Bill Goodfellow. This is the Center for International Policy. And we welcome Jonathan Steele, welcome all of you, and in particular Jonathan Steele and Ruth, his wife. And I was in Afghanistan in August, and along with Edward over here. And I was stunned by the deterioration of security in Kabul. Anybody, at one point, Edward was there as well, the British consuls was attacked. There was like a 6-hour firefight, and we were sitting in the bunker in our hotel, in the safe room of the hotel. My colleague, who had just narrowly missed getting hit by some stray bullets, said, I want to talk to these guys that are writing about the security advances in Afghanistan and Kabul, because Kabul had been, is this a rural insurgency? Kabul had been more or less out of the fight. Anyway, I've been reading your book. It is phenomenally good, and it's by far the best book I've read on contemporary Afghanistan, and we welcome you here and look forward to hearing from you and getting some questions.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for coming. What I want to do is to give a little bit of a flavor of what it was like during the Soviet occupation, because as Bill has just said, one of the main themes of the book is a sort of comparison and contrast between the Soviet occupation and the US, British, NATO occupation today. And then I want to end with a kind of 7-point plan for peace, how we all get out of here in as rapid a manner as possible. Send it right over to the right people. I was in the middle of an interview with the Afghan foreign minister when the heavy boom and rumble of a detonation interrupted us. What was that explosion? I asked. Explosion? What explosion? The minister responded with an elegant raising of his eyebrows, as though I was imagining things. It was November 1981, almost 2 years since Soviet troops had invaded, and the official spin from Moscow and its allies in Kabul was that everything was under control. Ah, yes, the dynamiting, the minister went on as another boom sounded in the distance. He looked relieved and eager to assure me that I was mistaken if I'd thought that I could hear the sound of war from his office in central Kabul, which was a stone's throw from the presidential palace. They do it almost every day, he went on, sometimes twice a day, for producing stones for construction, you understand. Well, the minister wanted me to understand that the explosions couldn't be military, since the war was virtually over. He said, we've destroyed the main hideouts of the bandits and the mercenaries. Now they can't act in a group form. It's only a few individuals who indulge in terrorist activities and sabotage, which is common all over the world. We hope to eliminate that also. Now, in the first weeks after the invasion of December 1979, Soviet officials had been so confident of quick victory that they gave Western reporters astonishing access, even allowing them to ride in or drive rented cars and taxis alongside Soviet convoys. By the spring of 1980, the mood had changed. The press was no longer welcome. There were no embeds for reporters to accompany a fighting unit, even for trusted Soviet correspondents. The war became a taboo in the Soviet media, while Western journalists who applied for Afghanistan visas were routinely refused. So the only way to cover the conflict was to endure days and nights of walking along precarious mountain paths with guerrilla fighters from the Mujahideen from safe havens in Pakistan. A few stories that appeared in Western papers via this route were cautious, sensible, and low-key, but many were romantic, self-promoting accounts of heroic exploits by reporters who donned the shalwar kameez or the pakol, the pie-shaped Afghan woolen hat, to slip into Afghanistan alongside the men with guns. The Mujahideen groups, of course, encouraged this adventure journalism, as I call it, uncritical, exaggerating, and occasionally dishonest. But it helped to bring support and funding from Western governments and sympathetic aid groups. By 1981, the Soviets were realizing the no-visa policy was a mistake. Their case was not being heard. So a handful of Western journalists were let in for short trips, in small groups or occasionally on their own. So in November that year, 1981, I did land in Kabul on a bright autumn morning after changing planes and an overnight stay in Delhi. After the heat of India's capital, I was struck by the extraordinary clarity of Kabul's air, as anybody who's been there recently knows. And the sky's deep blue, a colour that almost matches the country's most famous mineral, lapis lazuli. The city sits on a high plateau surrounded by a ring of khaki mountains. Khaki, by the way, is a Dari word meaning dust. The word was actually invented, if you like, for these mountains of Central Asia. And behind them, glittering in the distance, the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush. But it wasn't just Kabul's majestic surroundings that exuded this sense of calm. The city itself did. Where was the war? Where were the Russians, I wondered? In the 2 weeks I spent in the city, I saw hardly a single Soviet troop. The Soviets preferred to leave as many military duties as possible to Afghans, and they could. The effort in Kabul was successful, and security was in Afghan army and police hands. From what I could see in Kabul, the Soviets were indeed able to depend on Afghans for urban law and order, if not for real war fighting. I made 2 subsequent trips to Kabul during the Soviet occupation in 1986 and 88, and on both visits the city's calm was exactly the same. The car bombs and suicide attacks, which have become a permanent threat in today's Kabul, were unknown during the Soviet occupation. Afghans went about their daily business without fear of sudden mass slaughter. Unlike Kabul today, where no diplomats or foreign contractors have their partners or their children with them, many Soviet diplomats came with their families. The Soviet embassy had a flourishing kindergarten, grade school and high school. At the city's 2 university campuses, most young women were unveiled, as were most of the female staff in banks, stores, schools, factories, and government offices. A few wore hijab, a loose headscarf over their hair, but only in the bazaar, where the poorer people shopped, was the all-embracing burqa common. And from the evidence of my own eyes, the Mujahideen claims of a city under siege were false. The dozens of little kebab stalls in the street had as much lamb from the countryside as they needed. Pomegranates, watermelons, grapes spilled out of the bazaar. I never discovered a definitive explanation for these explosions that I'd heard during the interview with the foreign minister, but his point that Kabul was unaffected by the destruction of war was actually valid. I heard no other explosions during my time in the city. Of course, the countryside was another story. At the United Nations guest house in Kabul, a favourite place for foreigners to congregate at weekends, aid workers told me of their frustration at the restrictions they faced. The UN had dozens of consultants involved in rural development, but they were not allowed out of Kabul to supervise the projects they were supposed to be running. Afghan government officials admitted that because of the Mujahideen's activity, land reform was operating in only a quarter of the country's districts, and half the schools in Afghanistan were closed. It sounds rather similar to the situation today, I think. Foreign invaders can garrison Afghan cities with some help from local security forces. They can keep open the main roads that connect the cities, but penetrating the country's villages and finding support there is an altogether harder task. Of course, it's particularly hard in the south and east of the country, which borders on Pakistan. Every day during the Soviet period, as of now, dozens of resistance fighters infiltrate Afghanistan from their bases and refugee camps, just as they do today. So it wasn't surprising that Mikhail Gorbachev, who became Soviet leader in 1985, asked General Mikhail Zaitsev, who was the Soviet military commander at the time in Afghanistan, to evaluate the army's options. And Zaitsev reported that the only way to achieve military success would be to seal the country's borders with Pakistan, and this would require at least 250,000 troops. He said this was unrealistic. Sounds familiar again? How many times have US commanders and diplomats urged Pakistan to stop the infiltration of Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters across the border? Now, shortly before Gorbachev took over, General Valentin Varenikov, who was the head of the Defense Ministry's operational group in Afghanistan, had warned the Kremlin that the Afghan government was failing in the key counterinsurgency strategy of holding territory cleared of guerrillas. His comments were exactly the same as the problems facing US forces today. US counterinsurgency also works with the same formula of clear, hold, and build. But like the Russians, the Americans and the British in Kandahar and Helmand find that clearing is much easier than holding or building. Now, the